A perspective now from a longtime observer of British public opinion and politics. Peter Kellner is the former president of the polling firm YouGov. He's now a visiting scholar with Carnegie Europe. We spoke on Thursday, just as Theresa May was meeting with EU leaders in Brussels. First, how is the chaos and disarray in the British Parliament reflected in public opinion?
Public opinion is increasingly polarised on Brexit. This is unusual. Britain, I've been doing polls and reporting polls for 40 years, and usually the British public are pretty, well, they want a consensus. They don't mind compromise. They're pragmatic. But on Brexit, increasingly, there are two British tribes, the pro-Brexit tribe and the anti-Brexit tribe, and not many people in between favour a compromise position.
When you talk about compromise, though, and you talk about that polarization, is it about remain and leave, or is there something in the middle as well?
It is principally remain versus leave. So when you look at attitudes to the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement or some of the other proposals for a slightly softer Brexit, very few people support them because Remain voters don't see the point in having a compromise whereby Britain signs up to a lot of European rules without having any say in them. And Leave voters, on the whole, think a compromise isn't a real Brexit because Britain wouldn't take back control, to use the phrase that we used in the referendum 3 years ago. So people on neither side of the debate are particularly happy with what Theresa May has been doing or with what some of the other people looking for some other compromise outcome are doing.
Someone commented that everybody feels like losers here.
At the moment, it's heading in a very nervy way towards some climactic drama next week, because the formal position is that the British Parliament has passed a law which says unless something else happens, Britain will leave the European Union on Friday night next week, regardless of whether there's a deal or not. And a lot of people, especially in the business world, are terrified by this prospect. Just in the last hour or two, there has been a joint letter from the Confederation of British Industry, the employers' pressure group, and the Trades Union Congress, the Trades Union group. These two are normally at fighting each other, but they've come together to write a joint letter saying, whatever happens, we mustn't leave the European Union without a deal because it would be catastrophic for jobs, for investment and for living standards. But unless Parliament agrees to do something else, that is where we are heading.
At the same time, and we're speaking as the Prime Minister is in Brussels trying to negotiate some kind of extension. In an editorial this week, The Guardian also said that Theresa May is essentially playing a game that she's already lost. Do you agree?
Yes, I do. Until, I don't know, 48 hours ago, I thought the chances were that Theresa May would remain Prime Minister till at least later this year, possibly early next year, and that she would gracefully step down as Prime Minister after the Brexit drama had been concluded. But the way events have unfolded this week, and including the very misjudged television statement she made last night, which has produced a dreadful reaction against her from both Remain and Leave MPs, I think there's now a real possibility that she won't survive till the end of next week. Next week is going to be one of those big dramas of British politics, which historians will be poring over for decades to come. Normally, big dramas come into perspective 6 months or a year later and don't seem nearly as important as they did at the time. This is not one of those things. This really is big stuff.
Jeremy Corbyn was also in Brussels talking to EU leaders as well, and he's talking about, perhaps putting together some kind of compromise. Is there some other way to achieve a compromise other than through the Prime Minister's office?
Here's the problem. There are, let us say, somewhere between 200 and 250 MPs who would be happy with a so-called soft Brexit, where the economic relationships with the European Union don't change very much. We have a customs union deal of some sort, a single market deal of some sort. and there's a couple of hundred or so who would like a new referendum. The trouble is there's very little overlap between these two groups. Most MPs who want a new referendum think a soft Brexit is pointless. Most of those who want a soft Brexit think that a referendum would be a betrayal of the referendum 3 years ago. So although there's a large majority of MPs in Westminster who don't like the withdrawal agreements and would like, and certainly don't want no deal, would like a closer relationship, a much closer relationship with the European Union than the Prime Minister is proposing, they have two very different strategies for getting there. And as long as they remain divided, there won't be a majority in Parliament, 650 MPs overall, there won't be a majority for any one course of action. So I think a lot of the debate over the next few days is going to be whether those two clumps of MPs who want a close deal with Europe, whether they can somehow find a way to come together. It's by no means certain that they can.
Some have suggested that the way perhaps to get to some kind of answer on this is just to withdraw and start all over again. Is that realistic?
Well, one of the things that's been talked about, well, been talked about all the time, but talked about rather more loudly by more people this week, is that Britain does have the legal right at any time before Friday night next week to simply tell the European Union we're revoking our application to leave the EU. This doesn't need the approval of the rest of the EU. We just say we're carrying on. And the proposition is that if it gets to Wednesday or Thursday next week and Parliament is deadlocked, perhaps one way out is to revoke our Article 50 application to leave the EU, take a few weeks or months off, and if we still want to start the leave process, restart it again. At the moment, I wouldn't say that's a very probable outcome. But Alison, you know, there are perhaps 5 or 6 possibilities for the way things will work out this time next week. And at the moment, I wouldn't say any of them is a probable outcome. So something not very probable is bound to happen. What that is, I really don't know.
I know you've been watching politics and, as you point out, public opinion for decades now. Talk to me a little bit about the longer-term impact you see on British politics and how British citizens view their political system.
I think we're going through a dangerous time, and whatever the outcome of the Brexit process, we're going to be living with the fallout from this for 5, 10, maybe 20 years. The point about Brexit is not that it has created social divisions in Britain, but it has highlighted them and it has caused them to intensify. Let me explain what I mean. There has for a long time been a whole raft of British people who are outward going, internationalists in outlook, they're reasonably relaxed about immigration, they like overseas aid, being part pro-European Union is part of that package. And there's been another large block of public which is less outward looking, less keen on immigration, doesn't like overseas aid, would really, in a sense, rather like a moat around the British Isles to have the drawbridge pulled up and then they'd go and hide under a blanket and hope the rest of the world goes away. Now, those two sentiments, those two forces have always been there, but they've now found a vehicle for expression, and therefore the antagonisms between the two groups are much more intense. And trying to put together British society in some sort of consensual way is going to be a really, really tough job, and I think it'll take many years.
I thank you very much for your expertise and your insight on this.
Alison, you're very welcome.